Let's talk about it. Women are tired of objectification. This statement certainly comes as no astonishing claim or bewildering surprise. That women have been seeking innovation in the media in terms of representation and identities of being a woman in society. The depiction of women in film have been an ongoing struggle of spectacle, visual pleasure, and voyeurism, as well as feeding into what is known as the male gaze, a term invented by film theorist Laura Mulvey in her 1975 essay titled Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema. Cinema, being the moving image, has allowed a landscape of visual entrance into patriarchal enabling. While film serves as a passageway to spectatorship, other mediums such as video games, comic books, and even advertisements have also implemented objectification, and do so for all ages. Before analyzing the overarching outcomes, we must first delve into the intricate system known as the patriarchy. To assist in understanding what exactly this system is, American author and social activist Bell Hooks has astoundingly explained the patriarchy in her 2004 book titled A Will to Change. In Chapter 2, Understanding Patriarchy, she defines the patriarchy saying, "Patriarchy is a political social system that insists that males are inherently dominating, superior to everything and everyone deemed weak, especially females, and endowed with the right to dominate through various forms of psychological terrorism and violence." In this chapter, she breaks down her own experience as a girl growing up with a brother and as a coming-of-age woman in a society rooted into the patriarchal system. She voices the expectations that were put upon her for men to be makers of meaning and women the bearers of meaning. To simplify, men establish societal meaning, and by the bearer of meaning, the women are to conform and vindicate what is established for them. We as children are taught patriarchy before we even know what it means, and by having this unconscious knowing of expectations within gender, we bring the system with us into adulthood. It is important to know that the patriarchy is not a system solely faulted on men, but is a dual effort for both men and women to uphold the patriarchal system. For contemporary feminists, she states, "It is no accident that feminists began to use the word patriarchy to replace the more commonly used male chauvinism and sexism." In this chapter, there is a clear difference between visionary radical feminism and anti-male activism. The anti-male perspective guilts patriarchy on men dominating society, deeming women as powerless. This can be problematic as it puts women in the role of victim, which Hooks makes the connection that this notion exposes the very thing that patriarchy upholds, a position of needing to be saved. That men are powerful and women powerless. Rather, Hooks coins herself as a visionary radical feminist. The visionary radical feminist perspective challenges the rhetoric of anti-male activism and voices the need to acknowledge the source of male pain. Although, what exactly does she mean by saying male pain? In this chapter, she speaks of Terrence Real, a family therapist and author who has shared his own experience with raising his two sons. In How Can I Get Through to You, Real discloses that his younger son, Alexander, would enjoy playing with dolls, especially Barbie dolls, as a young child. This was until his older brother's friends witnessed him playing with them and were appalled by this. This sent him a message of disapproving behavior and taught him to feel shame. He designates a term for this incident being normal traumatization for boys. In this shared experience, Hooks traces it back to her claim of expectations among gender. The doll he was playing with was assigned a gender-appropriate role determined by the makers of meaning. Among these gendered expectations, men are deemed value in their will to do violence for appropriate causes, whereas women could take no part but encouraged to express emotion, despite anger. For men, rage is sanctioned as a mechanism for protection and servitude. Women, on the other hand, had the right to feel emotion for the purpose of nurturer and caregiver. She claims these expectations leave men emotionally crippled, and this enforces patriarchal masculinity. She then concludes this chapter by saying, if men are to reclaim the essential goodness of male being, if they are to regain the space of open-heartedness and emotional expressiveness, That is the foundation of well-being. We must envision alternatives to patriarchal masculinity. We must all change. Shifting from philosophy to film theory, Laura Mulvey expands on the patriarchal system with its force in cinema. In her book, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, Mulvey focuses her ideology on the fascination of looking with a psychoanalytical approach. She states her intent in writing the essay by saying, "By using psychoanalysis to discover where and how the fascination of the film is reinforced by pre-existing patterns of fascination already at work within the individual subjects, and the social formations that have molded him." This term does not equate to psychology, as psychoanalytical theory focuses on the unconscious mind. It is deemed worthy of political and social recognition, and the unconscious of patriarchy has shaped our film narrative forms and understandings. The ideology of phallocentrism is having a phallus, a male reproductive organ, is the internal core and fundamental principle in the social world. As Mulvey points out, the flip side of this is what is known as the paradox of phallocentrism, being the image of a castrated woman, no phallus, gives meaning and order to its world. In forming the unconscious of patriarchy, women symbolize the threat of not having a phallus, hence inducing voyeurism and fetishistic mechanisms. Mulvey makes the connection with bell Hooks's Understanding Patriarchy, reminding us that women have been deemed as bearers of meaning, not makers of meaning. This key notion is essential to recognizing how it has structured film. We are then introduced to scopophilia, simply the pleasure of looking. This term aids in the objectification of women, especially in media formats. With psychoanalytical theory, Mulvey observes how Sigmund Freud relates this feeling to early childhood, the developmental stages of our being. As children do, they are curious about everything and everyone. The absence or presence of the phallus grows curiosity about the anatomy of the human body. This begins the discovery of sexual difference, teetering between desire and anxiety. Masculinity is now sewn into the ego and serves as a patriarchal threat. Constituting ego forms our desire to look, and a basis for pleasure in objectifying people. Mulvey reflects this ideology through French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, who describes that the moment a child recognizes its image in the mirror is crucial for the constitution of the ego. The first moment of a child seeing its reflection creates a new perception of the self, a reflective body, establishing a new language for the child. Mulvey writes that important for this article is the fact that it is an image that constitutes the matrix of the imagery, of recognition, misrecognition, and identification, and hence of the first articulations of the I, of subjectivity. The cinema has techniques and structure to reinforce the ego while simultaneously allowing temporary loss of ego, coming from the images that are seen and shown. It is with the sense of looking that once becomes pleasurable can be threatening due to the woman representing castration as a threat, defining the paradox of phallocentrism. Introducing the male gaze, Mulvey states, in a world ordered by sexual imbalance, pleasure in looking has been split between active male and passive female. The determining male gaze projects its fantasy onto the female figure, which is styled accordingly. The term male gaze functions as the way heterosexual male perspectives depict women in visual art form. In film, women were subjected to be the erotic object for the characters of the story, as well as the erotic object for the spectators, the people looking. Mulvey gives the example of Marilyn Monroe, as she was used for persuasive looking for male gazers. With the use of frame size, angles, slow body pans, and her interaction with the male protagonist. These erotic imageries aren't subjected to film alone, but society and civilization as a whole, as seen in paintings, novels, and even photography. The sole purpose of the woman's character was her value in her to be looked at-ness. She furthers her claim by giving examples from Alfred Hitchcock's 1958 film, Vertigo. We follow the character of Scotty and his perspective in comparison to the character Judy. His erotic interests form the character of Judy, as the depiction of beauty and perfection, partaking in active voyeurism. The term voyeurism is defined as the practice of obtaining sexual gratification from observing others, consensual or non-consensually. When scopophilia and voyeurism attach to the male gaze, you form a patriarchal system in cinema with the active male and passive female, allowing spectatorship to conform to patriarchal submission. A prime example of the male gaze in cinema is the film Mulholland Drive, 2001, directed by David Lynch. The film follows a young blonde, all-American girl named Betty and her aspiration of being a Hollywood star. On her arrival in Hollywood, she meets a famous actress named Rita. Although Rita is experiencing amnesia from a car accident and she has no memory of her real identity or how she survived, the two form a friendship and later a romantic relationship as they search for answers to the accident. The film is an illusionary and abstract story, with many comparing it to Hitchcock's work or The Twilight Zone. The film has no hesitation in eroticizing both Betty and Rita. The film portrays a queer romance, although it's quite obvious in the framework, as well as the narrative, that the gaze was precisely intended for the male spectator. The intimate scenes enunciate the male gaze in a voyeuristic approach, where the bodies of the women are displayed with the intent of a spectacle framework. Their space within the dimensions of the film feeds into the male gaze and fetishistic scopophilia, building up the conventional beauty of the object and transforming it into satisfying the spectator. While the story contains two women as main characters, it is without a doubt that the main motivations are again enforced with their male counterparts. The character known as Rita discovers her true identity as Camila. It is Camila who is in a romantic relationship with the character Adam, film director who distributes roles in his films to women, be it a reflection of realistic Hollywood cinema. The narrative staggers into an experimental and complex flow of storytelling and falters the truths within the film. If Lynch intended to portray intense eroticism, then it is fair to say the film accomplished said goal. This would be the male gaze that Mulvey describes, the image of women as passive, raw material for the active gaze of man, takes the argument a step further into the structure of representation, adding a further layer demanded by the ideology of the patriarchal order as it is worked out in its favorite cinematic form, illusionistic narrative film. Despite the time in which Mulholland Drive was made, there has been progress in resisting patriarchal cinema. The film Portrait of a Lady on Fire, 2019, directed by French filmmaker Céline Sciamma, took the film world by storm. The period piece centers around Marianne, a generational painter who is commissioned to paint a portrait of Eloise for marital intent. In the film, Marianne arrives to the isolated island where she spends her days observing and quietly watching Eloise, secretly painting this portrait of her. The two develop a romantic relationship, and it is the gendered societal role of being a woman that challenges the two's love. The film depicts the romance intimately and attentively, with a hyper-focus on the moments. These moments are expressed through gazing, whether at one another or in moments of observing each other. Céline has graciously portrayed the two lovers in an intelligent and sensual manner, as emotions are the driving force within the film. There is a stark contrast between Mulholland Drive and Portrait of a Lady on Fire, where eroticism in queer romance has been replaced with intimacy and appreciative livelihood, male gaze versus the female gaze, where feelings are felt and shameful depiction of women in cinema has been cast aside to combat patriarchal mechanisms in film. There is an effort within this film to remove men in general, only having portrayed women characters. The film is all about observing within the female gaze. In an article written by BFI, Céline voices her intent, stating, "I wanted to craft a love story and tell the story of women artists. I wanted it to be a mix of a creative story and a romance." For contemporary cinema, it is fair to say that we have yet to demolish patriarchal systems, if there will ever be such a society. It has been deeply embedded into us that imagining a world as so can be quite difficult, but it is far from impossible. Visionary radical feminism and voicing the issues of patriarchal society has been the key components to challenging the patriarchal system. Recognizing films such as Mulholland Drive and the male gaze allows us to expose and learn from such art forms, where Portrait of a Lady on Fire can confront and adjust the gaze. Maybe one day the patriarchy will only be a memory to society, left behind in the history of cinema. The ideal cinema, where patriarchy never exists.